Welcome to the new Cyber Frontier, bringing you the latest news and initiatives that focus on the development of cybersecurity economics. You don't have to be a computer or cybersecurity expert to get plugged in. Your host brings it straightforward, asks the tough questions, and brings the cyber world to a level of understanding for everyone. You can find us on the web at www.newcyberfrontier.com. Now join our host as he introduces the topic for today's New Cyber Frontier.
Welcome to today's episode of New Cyber Frontier. This is going to be a unique show, even as far as my shows go, because I don't know much about Dominic Paulo, our guest, except for that we met at a History Society event. And this guy, out of the cold, asked the right questions, started just kind of drilling me. And I was like, I want to have this candid conversation from somebody that is, I'll let him explain his background because I don't have a good grasp on it. And it's on purpose because I want to have that same kind of candid Q&A question about technology. And from somebody who is a little bit outside that can give, we'll say, a lay insight on, does this make sense to somebody coming in cold? But Dominic, welcome. Thanks for joining today.
Yeah, fabulous to be here. It's a great opportunity to have an interesting conversation. You don't run into too many people that you can just sit down with, and they have a lot of interesting thoughts and things to say.
Yeah. So tell us about your background. And you're really telling me for the first time too, other than, I know you're a friend of a friend, which I won't mention names.
Yeah.
And we had an interesting 10-minute conversation. I was like, we got to have this on the air. But give us your background. How do you got here?
Yeah, so I've been technologically inclined from the get-go. I had an opportunity to work as a junior engineer right outside of high school. Never got credentialed. Taught myself most of the things in technology. And used that as sort of a springboard to write my own ticket, which I've been doing up until about 5 years ago, in which I kind of switched careers. I've worked in everything from call center to computer sales to network engineer, system developer, programmer. I come from a very perhaps gray hat origin. And as I transitioned into the fintech space, that was no longer something I could indulge in for numerous reasons. Usually you don't have very many investors that are interested in working with someone with that might end up in jail pretty quickly. So I had to go on the straight and narrow, and I ended up actually doing a lot of gray area work in the fintech space. And the last project I worked on, and the thing I kind of walked away from, was I was designing a system for trading energy contracts out of California. Mm-hmm. And so I was pulling together a bunch of different data resources from a gentleman who was leaving a major trading desk and wanted to basically have a boutique data source for trading energy contracts. Mm-hmm. Ended up not really taking off. And after that, I got kind of tired of making money for rich people. And so I figured, go do something else. And so now I'm working more in the environmental space. I'm getting credentialed. I'd like to do conservation. Mm-hmm. And so that kind of, one of the things that I think is really interesting is that if you go from a very layperson perspective, when you talk about things like blockchain and where a lot of your work effort is, I think a lot of people, the first thought is that we're going to destroy the environment, right? Like we're literally burning down trees and servers are lighting everything on fire and things are going to be terrible. And I don't know that there's a lot of like mainstream perspective around where blockchain is, what it can do. And so I'm really interested. Like I said, I've been out of the space for about 5 or 6 years. I did not follow what crypto was doing and a lot of the applications that were built on blockchain technology. I did a deep dive for the last week, was reading research papers, went through a lot of your back catalog, try to get up to speed on all the terminology, the things that really prevent lay people from understanding the underlying mechanics of a system. Mm-hmm. And so I have a pretty good broad knowledge of kind of where things are at right now. And I just really interested in this idea that there's a lot of incredibly interesting intersections going on The one thing that I've been kind of laughing about is that you have this idea of Bitcoin mining, and I think the term mining was incredibly apropos, as it seems to be suffering from a lot of the boom and bust cycle that you found in the original gold rush. And we're kind of approaching that point where perhaps you're going to have consolidation, and a lot of the work that's built from here, there isn't going to be as many opportunities for your individual prospectors to go out there and find much.
Mm-hmm.
But in the same ways, we're already went through a bust cycle. You have a lot of this hardware that's sitting there, collecting dust. Obviously, with the proof of work, you've got to have more and more robust and computational intensive hardware. You had the entire cycle with them buying up all of the GPUs that they could get their hands on. And most of that stuff, it lasts, 6 months, barely a cycle. Then they've got to increase, the amount of work that it can do. And it just, who's going to use it, right? They're going to send it to, these are custom made computational parts. So it's not like you can take these video cards and sell them on the market to a bunch of gamers, right? Like these
Mm-hmm.
are generally very boutique types of hardware. And so for me, it's really interesting looking at it from kind of a very macro perspective of what's, what the ecological impact of this is going to be longer term, right?
Yeah.
Without a really strong, again, like I grew up before the internet. I grew up on BBSs, dial-up modems, war dialing. All of that was where I got my start. And so I can think of the internet back then, and I couldn't imagine it being where it is today without a lot of the hard work that the people who were building the protocols were doing, right? There was this mission that people were putting together that they believed in, and there was a lot of structure there, enough to really kind of develop apps and things on top of it. We had the OSI model and all the things that you need to basically have these emergent technologies spring forth.
Mm-hmm.
But with the crypto space and blockchain, there really doesn't seem to be a whole lot of that. A lot of it just seemed to be a very fast cash grab. And so it's really interesting to me that, I can see the use case for a lot of blockchain applications, but they're really not matured, obviously. And again, reading your dissertation makes it pretty clear where a lot of those challenges are. And so I find that's just an incredibly interesting space to dig into. And I imagine these will have huge implications down the road for the winners and losers. You talk a lot about digital privacy. One of the things that really fascinated me about your back catalog was there's this sort of through line about connecting with people and making this a project about individual humans, much more than just the technology piece. And being fixated on the profiteering, the centralizing, again, I think we talked about this a little bit, but, it's this idea of, all of the money's still on the table and people are deciding who's going to walk away with that, right? And so there are a lot of forces right now that see the writing on the wall where this is going, and obviously they want to position themselves to benefit as much as possible.
So
At least that's my
So
impression.
if I took a step back and said, from an individual out there, and you mentioned some of the big things, you probably heard a couple things I said about that on different things, but where do you see positioning? What do you want to see as a private citizen that is going to partake and have your offspring partake in the digital world? Where do you think that things should be? How should things go?
I always come back to that old adage of, people planting trees that they'll never sit under. It's a
Mm-hmm.
pretty straightforward way to look at life. And I think ultimately we here today have, I guess, from my philosophical perspective, we have an obligation to plant those trees, right? So in this case, I feel like that means looking at the really limited end game with something like, for example, Bitcoin, right? Like you talk about issues with its scalability. You can't scale forever, data issues, just there are so many complications there, right? So at some point, there's going to be an apocalypse with it. It's going to have to be reborn in some form. And what does that look like, right? Like, and if there isn't a legislative framework, if your everyday average citizen isn't involved on some level, has some basic knowledge about what's going on, I just don't see people having very much of a stake in the outcomes here because it is so esoteric. A lot of this stuff, I couldn't imagine. Again, I try to have these conversations with people, and you get about 3 or 4 buzzwords in and their eyes just glaze over. Like the appetite for being able to understand this is incredibly complex. Again, I grew up reading RFCs. I grew up reading protocols, so this is right down my alley. It's not something that is, but I'm an outlier, right? Like I'm not your average person. And again, I would look at myself more as like a citizen activist, just someone who likes the space, thinks it's cool, and wants to know more about it. And
So
I
what
think
questions do you have? I mean, now you've digested in, so it seems like some of your questions you had earlier have been answered, but what did you find out that was answered, or what still do you have, you're interested in understanding?
well, so there was a specific part that you were talking about. Get into the weeds here for a second, and you were talking about the initial adaptation to get into your specific framework, talking about how when you are first building up this sort of momentum into a product, you have early adoption. But as these products mature, the people that are operating the servers don't necessarily have an incentive to continuously operate these over time, just because there isn't a large maybe profit incentive, right? So I thought that was a really astute observation and an interesting place to think about what people's incentive structures are. Because for me, I think anytime you're dealing with a market, anytime you're dealing with legislative frameworks, you're always thinking about incentives. That's going to determine what the outcomes look like, right? And obviously, what we've seen from the first go around is that there's a huge economic incentive. Like you can put money on the table, people are going to design a thing if there's some arbitrage there, right? That's just the way the system works. And so I think as someone who's looking to design the system, it becomes a question of how do you design an incentive there that's going to give, because it seems like, from what I understand, once the system is stood up, you're looking to have a lot of like private participation in this. You're not just looking for, let's say, for example, you're not necessarily looking for state governments to fund this entire thing, right? And I guess maybe we should start back at my interest in sort of like what you're looking to do here in Colorado. And again, that's like I live in Colorado. I'm interested in what the outcome for Colorado is. I went and read a bit of the literature on where Colorado is with regards to blockchain and crypto. They seem fairly permissive. The tagline was maybe a wait and see attitude. And so I think while you might say a moratorium or wait and see, there's a lot of room there to build infrastructure, right? And so as this infrastructure gets built out, I want to see a system that is scalable, that isn't burning down all the trees. It isn't a race to the bottom, and yet it fulfills the needs of doing transactions. Like, we're going to put digital medical records, right? Like you have all of these potential applications of this technology. And for me, I want to see the fact that I'm not destroying the environment while I'm doing this. It's being done in a way that, to the degree with which it can, it respects individuals' privacy. And then the individual has some control, has some stake in this. Like, for example, maybe there's a public API that allows them to go look up records, right? So they can verify the accuracy of what's actually there. And I think in the system that we live in now, it's very hard to feel like you have very much control over records that go to the government. So, looking at where it seems like the government mandate comes from this is to open up and have more transparency for the citizen. And obviously, if you're getting into the deep technical parts of this, right, they're not going to be able to use those. They need a front-end application that's very user-friendly and can do very specific things, right? They're not going to query a database or do any of the more complicated things that you would need if you were doing this from like a system developer level. And so for me, I want to see a system that is robust for users. As a parallel, you've heard about the thing in New York where they had AI, and then it was giving the wrong answers, right? They were asking it statutory questions and it couldn't even answer those questions correctly, right? And the government there decided to leave it in place for whatever reason. I have no idea. But it seems a lot of that is about optics, right? So I want to see a system that has been tested. It's not going to just be set up and it's not going to be able to provide anything sort of useful technology for technology's sake. Blockchain was a shiny thing maybe 2 years ago because of crypto, and then NFTs followed quickly behind that. And then, right now, the business herd is obsessed with AI. Everything's got to be AI. neural networks,
So
large.
question,
Yeah, go ahead.
do you do anything in blockchain or NFTs? Do you
I
work?
actually have stayed out of it. I had a bunch of family members that would ask, hey, do I want to set up the crypto miner, this, that, and the other thing. And I guess for me, I looked at it and thought, this is a little too early for adaptation. For an early adopter, I just have seen so much technology fall on its face that it just seemed, again, like another, tulip scandal,
Uh-huh.
bright, shiny thing. Again, people just get enamored with it. There was a lot of sales around what was going on. And I just gave me a really bad feeling
So
about
what do you
the
think
entire thing.
about the Security Exchange Commission now going after some of those earlier releases of tokens and saying, "Hey, you defrauded people. You sold snake oil, and 1 million people bought it because they all bought the crypto before them, and now there's like a rush from one to the next and get rich quick, and we need to protect the consumer, so we're going to start going after these companies."
I mean, that's essentially the challenge of being in a position of legislation. You're always, and again, you look at history, we're always too late to the party, right? Like the thing happens, horses out of the barn, and what are you going to do about it? Whose hands are you going to slap? I mean, and from, sort of maybe a moral perspective, is it right to go after people when there were no guidelines, right? Like you can tell people that these are things that are going to hurt private citizens and individuals, but that isn't, I mean, the philosophical mandate of the market is to money at any cost, right? Like that's a society we live in. And as much as I personally disagree with that, businesses have a mandate to do that. That's
So
just the world we live in.
do you think that will ever change? Or I see, we'll say, a younger generation that grows up with a value system that's more about online and virtual value than physical world value. They're disengaging from the need for physical things as long as they have their nest of computers around them and capability for online access. And it's changing a little bit. Do you see society moving in a different direction there?
I don't know that society ever changes, like, right? Like it just reverberates through history and we have new expressions. Um,
Okay.
I don't know that we're really going to see substantial change. Like, again, I have a bunch of younger family members. I see the way that they use TikTok. And they have novel ways of engaging with this technology. But the underlying manifestation for that, right? Like, as overwrought as this is, young people, the number one job is to be an influencer, right? To be someone who has internet clout. Um, and I think a lot of those motivations are going to be a big part of what generates interest in the internet. Now, I wouldn't be able to go to that young person and ask them, like, how do you configure this? What operating system does this phone run? What is the legacy of this device, right? Like they don't know any of those things because they know it from a very superficial level. They can open TikTok, they can install apps, but their knowledge isn't very deep. And I think there is kind of a misunderstanding a lot of times from people who think that the knowledge goes a lot deeper than that. I do think in the sense that, a fish to water, they're a lot more aware of the environment that they're growing up in. So they are interacting with technology in new ways that we didn't grow up. Again, dating myself as someone who grew up through the technology revolution of the 90s, right? You go from no internet to internet. And I think the way that they interact with one another is definitely going to change. But I am somewhat hesitant because I see, I read in a lot of literature about this loneliness epidemic, right? There's a lot of hand-wringing about physical relationships, about people becoming, having the social skills to interact with people in real space. And from my personal experience, I've worked with youth through scouting and other programs. I volunteer a lot. And that's been my personal experience. They have a difficult time going offline and being in the real world. Now, day or two in, they're usually pretty well adjusted, but their social graces are fairly limited. And again, this is coming from someone who was an extreme introvert growing up. And I recognize some of those same trends looking at these young people. And so I think that's kind of more in the direction that I see a lot of young people is just this atomization and disconnection. And I think despite the fact that a lot of us, myself included, want to see technology as a thing that brings us together, the ideal utopian meta space, right? Like we're all wearing headsets, we're playing Ready Player One, and we're all hanging out, in the virtual world having a great time. I don't know that I see that as the definite future, right? Like, again, I feel like we're kind of at an inflection point. If we let the market just kind of dictate what's going on without a lot of people that have, I guess I would say, bigger ideas about the humanity of this technology, and how we're going to implement that to make human connection. Um,
So you
I
think
don't know that.
that's the next direction is implementing technology to make the human experience, the human connection. I've heard you kind of circle around that almost the whole time you've been talking.
Yeah, well, I think no matter what technology we're talking about, um, human beings need connection. We need community, and without that, we are atomized. We're separate, and there's something missing in us. And I think the ultimate promise of this kind of technology is the fact that it can connect us. It can allow us to form a more robust society where we're just more comfortable interacting with one another. Like I feel like that's kind of the dream here.
Yeah.
And so,
So
go ahead. I'm sorry.
I'm just curious about that because, like you said, you grew up, more introvert, and I know, even though I probably would have been, halfway between introvert and extrovert, maybe neutral in that area growing up, I had a heck of a lot less people in my whole spectrum of awareness. We'll just say than now. I mean, it's just, we're connected to everybody, and it's like you have to learn how to connect to hundreds of people at a time, no matter what you're doing. But back then, I remember if you worked with 3 or 4 people, you knew the people on your shift, you knew the people working with you, you knew the people on your team. You didn't think in terms of hundreds and thousands of people. You thought in terms of handfuls.
Yeah, that's absolutely true. I would suggest that perhaps you had deeper relationships with those people. Um, I feel like a lot of our relationships today are much more performative and transactional. Um, and again, I just think that's, again, incentives. And it's an outcome of the system that we're in. It
Yeah.
incentivizes the performative aspect, the cherry picking of our lives so that we can have the best moments and then put them on social media so that everyone else can imagine how great our lives are, right? Like
Imagine
that's the game
whether
that we're all
it is
playing.
to you or not, they get a picture of it.
Yeah, and there's this financial incentive there, right? Like how many influencers exist that get invited to tropical locations, have fabulous dinners,
Hmm.
have amazing people on their arms, and it's really just all of us selling ourselves on this dream that, again, it's a fantasy that we all want to construct, and I feel like
Is that
that's kind
different
of
than the everybody wanting to be a rock star or an athlete back in, we'll say, our day?
well. So I think you also have to take that with what I would consider diminishing opportunities, right? Like um, if you want to look at the data, it's there. It suggests that prosperity is somewhat declining. And I think young people have an intuitive sense of that. And they're looking for what can I do in the future that's going to give me an opportunity to do something that's amazing, right? And I see a lot of young people that are like, it's influencer or bust. They're all in on this idea. And then if it isn't that, they just
So, what
hang out.
percentage of them make influencer versus what percentage are bust?
I mean, you probably have a better chance being like a day trader than becoming an influencer, right? Like I
So
can't.
it's like back in our day of being a movie star or an athlete or a rock star. It's just the same numbers, right? Same odds, but yet everybody's do it or bust, is like you said.
We are terrible. We are terrible when it comes to like statistics and math. Like we as human beings just do not have a good appetite for risk,
Yeah.
statistically. So, I mean, the perception of risk versus reward makes it seem like the ability to be an influencer is amazing. The Mr. Beastification of everything. You just want to get to be that person, right? Like I would love to be able to buy friends of mine's just cars. Like here you go. Here's a car. Enjoy it. I did this because I made people happy on the internet and I designed a
But
program
isn't
that.
that what people that got in on Bitcoin early are doing? Have the capability, and it's not influencing. It is a behind the scenes tech technical or foresight into, hey, everybody's going to want this whether it has value or not. I'm getting ahead on the trend that everybody's going to buy from me later.
Yeah, I mean, I think that there's always that appetite for being the first one in. And again, I watched the blockchain Bitcoin rise up. I actually tinkered with setting up a miner early on, but I mean, I looked at like SETI at home, right? Like for me, that was far cooler that I might be able to detect a signal from extraterrestrials. And it's like, am I going to go and do this thing that's like some speculative, strange crypto algorithmic thing that I don't completely understand? Or I can set up SETI at home and I might be able to find aliens. Like there are always these opportunities and you're never sure which one's going to shake out. And you look at it in retrospect and you think, wow, I could have been that person who minted a bunch of coins and now I would just be, Bitcoin rich and famous and I could have cashed out. And, that's true, but you're never aware of that opportunity when it's happening. It's always in retrospect. So I think there's an incredible tendency to imagine that we could have been that person because like right now there are opportunities that we're all not seeing because obviously we did, like that's the arbitrage of it all. We could see it, we'd be in it, and then there would be no money to be made. Like that's just the nature of those types of systems. And none of us really has the foresight to be able to pick the winners from the losers. Like we all imagine, again, this is why we all are terrible at trading, picking tops and bottoms of the stock market. Every person who goes and like tries to day trade or, gets involved in the stock market thinks I'm going to be the person. I'm the Nostradamus of the stock market and I know where the tops and the bottoms are going to be. And it's like, no, the data shows, again, very bad at risk. You're going to be selling when you should be buying and buying when you should be selling.
That 90% of the people have to fail in order for the people that are successful to work.
It's a zero-sum game.
Yeah,
that's all there is to it. And
so, yeah, just before we're getting to the end of the time here, but since our show's about cybersecurity, I wanted kind of just shoot off the, what is your impression of security? Is it something you should even bother with? Is it something that affects you greatly? Is it something you stay up at night thinking about? Or is it just us security people in this industry?
I have a very low internet profile because, again, I grew up. I'm probably on several government lists, and so I've tried to keep a fairly low profile for that very reason, right? Like, our security is incredibly important. Young people certainly do not understand this, and you have no control over any of the data we're putting online. Like, we are the product. We are being sold 24/7, and I don't know if there's a way to really communicate that to people. I don't necessarily stay up at night because, again, it's one of those things like, yes, it's terrifying, but it's the abyss. What are you going to do about it? You're one person, and the best you can do is try to articulate these ideas to the community around you, and try to find, what is the takeaway? What is the thing that they can do that would have an impact, right? And so, again, when I deal with young people, you talk to them about internet literacy, the type of information that is online and the real impacts of that and what it's going to mean for them going down the road, right? And that's something that's so abstract to them that it's hard to get them to internalize that information. And so, yeah, I mean, I think security is something that if it were easier to communicate to the end user, sure, I think that's something that we should try to get across. But again, this is the challenge of like science communicators, right? How do you encapsulate an idea that's mimetic enough that it can be, again, this is why I like memes. I think memes are fantastic because they encapsulate the idea of something that is so simple that it can be top text, bottom text, image, and it just passes through the mind in some way that's very sticky. And I think science communicators, the skill to that is really finding a way to encapsulate these ideas that stick in the brain. And so that you're not constantly struggling. You're not constantly doing, the climate change global warming snafu, right? It all comes down into the marketing and the way you're selling these things. And so as a security professional, making sure that you can identify what the prescient threats are going to be, the things that are at the top of the stack, and then be able to communicate those in ways that your end user is going to understand. Because again, for the most part, they want to tune you out. They just want to doom scroll, right? Like you have very few people that are going to intentionally sit down and consume media with the purpose of educating themselves. It's like you're doing this thing in a way that's very backdoor or subconscious. You have to kind of slide it in. You're basically giving them the pills with the peanut butter, right? And so you got to find a way that it goes down easy. And I think that's kind of the challenge of security is that it's complex. Like, I mean, we could probably have, hours long conversation about the nuance of,
Believe me, I do all the time.
Yeah, I watch, like I said, I watch your back catalog, and a lot of that is the very technical stuff that gets into PKI and all of the other infrastructural questions that you have when you're dealing with this kind of this broad and this big of a concept, right?
Yeah. Well, it's been a pleasure. We're kind of at the end of the time for our show. I'd love to have you on occasionally and just maybe even not tell you why I'm going to bring you on. Say, hey, talk to me about this from a lay perspective, and let you flounder a little bit. But you did your research before you came in, so a lot of the questions you were drilling me on, I think you've kind of resolved. So
I love academia. I'm one of those people, like, you give me a subject, looking at some of your background, you're one of those people who like goes deep into subjects. I enjoy that. I enjoy the reading, putting together, like, I'm a systems person. I want to understand the big picture. And so what fascinates me a lot about what your doctoral work involves and what you're currently working on is very big picture. And there's a lot of cool stuff going on here in Colorado. We didn't really have a chance to talk about that, but definitely going to follow up on the consortium here that's really looking into blockchain. I believe it's Colorado College in partnership with some other places that are...
University of Colorado is where we're headquartered at.
And so just jumping into that, it was fascinating to see, like, you have some Coast Guard doing some of this security blockchain work. There's a lot of organizations that I wasn't even aware of that are dipping their toes in. So again, for young people looking for potential career options, if you're a technical person, you want to get in the weeds, like, if I were young and I was looking for how do I come up in this industry, like, world-class education. And so, yeah, I'd be very interested in a lot of these opportunities that Colorado's making available, and a lot of the institutions here are kind of building upon. And again, we're at the very beginning of this. Like, there is no real substantial infrastructure. This is, before the web became the web, right? These are protocols that will define, what your kids are using at some point. So it's an exciting time to be in this space.
I would like to see that in the future, but right now, like you said, somebody has to plant the seed to grow the tree. And a lot of times I feel like I'm still keeping that sapling from getting eaten by the animals, the bunnies and the deers. And we'll go from there, hopefully. But yeah, we kind of wanted to close this, but great to have you on, Dominic. Thanks again for joining. And like I said, I want to bring you on again, and we'll catch up again.
I appreciate your time. Thank you.
Thank you. Bye.
We hope you have enjoyed this episode of New Cyber Frontier. Remember to get involved. Often we think that someone else will handle privacy and security in the virtual world, but you are the only one truly in command of your virtual fate. Join our mailing list so we can keep you informed of breaking news and new releases. If you have an idea, if you have a question that you would like to hear answered, or if you want to get involved with our efforts, reach out to us at newcyberfrontier.com. We also encourage you to visit our sponsors' links, as they are the ones that really make this show possible. I want to thank each of you for supporting the show, and we look forward to seeing you back for the next episode of New Cyber Frontier.